You finally reached the milestone you've been working toward for years. The promotion, the pristine house, the financial safety net. That means you can finally buy the expensive organic berries at the grocery store without having to do the mental math. You are sitting in a room full of everything you ever wanted, and somehow you just feel completely empty. You wonder if you are deeply ungrateful, or if the thing you were chasing all this time has actually become a cage.
Yeah, that feeling of looking around at the life you've built, realizing you followed all the rules.
Right, you did exactly what you were supposed to do to earn safety.
Exactly. But instead of feeling secure and connected to the people around you, you feel isolated, almost like you're watching your own life from behind a thick pane of glass.
And there are really two honest ways to understand this feeling of hollow achievement. From one perspective, this emptiness is the emotional cost of building a false self. It's this highly competent mask you created to earn approval, which is now cutting you off from true intimacy.
But from another perspective, this isn't just an emotional metaphor. It is a measurable psychological condition. The actual accumulation of resources structurally rewires the brain, actively degrading cognitive empathy and isolating you from human connection.
So we are pulling from a fascinating stack of sociological data today. Mid-century psychoanalysis, modern behavioral economics, all to figure out exactly what happens when you win a game that was basically designed to break you.
We have notes from clinical psychologists, historical data on wealth and behavior, and some truly staggering neurobiology studies.
Right, because if the false self is basically a desperate emotional strategy to secure love, why does securing that love in the form of money and status actually make us less capable of feeling it? Like, is the brain literally changing as the bank account grows?
To answer that, we really have to look at the mechanics of survival, because what we're really talking about is adaptation.
Okay, let's start with the human side, the felt reality. Think about the person listening right now who has survived their life and frankly succeeded in their life through a relentless punishing drive.
Right, we're talking about deep perfectionism here.
Exactly. This uncanny radar-like ability to anticipate what a boss, a partner, or a parent needs before they even open their mouths. You learn early on that love or safety is conditional.
Conditional on being exceptional.
Yes, on being the golden child, on never, ever being the one who causes a problem. And it works. I mean, it gets you the degree, the job, the resources.
It's a hypervigilance that gets massively rewarded by capitalism.
But the armor you put on to survive just keeps growing heavier. Eventually, it blocks out the warmth entirely. It's like you were thrown into the deep ocean as a kid, and to survive, you built this incredible, heavy, pressurized brass diver suit.
Which is a miracle of engineering, really.
Right, it kept you from being crushed.
Yeah.
But now you're an adult. You're standing on dry land. You're walking down the cereal aisle in a 200-pound brass diver suit, looking around, wondering why you can't feel the breeze on your skin.
And why you feel so exhausted just taking a single step.
Exactly. The pursuit of more has paradoxically resulted in you feeling less.
And, that feeling of exhaustion of the heavy suit on dry land, it isn't a new phenomenon. It has been documented in sociological circles for over a century. It even has a clinical history under a term that is highly controversial, which is affluenza.
Which sounds like a terrible punchline. I mean, it sounds completely made up.
It is a portmanteau of affluence and influenza, yes, but its usage is surprisingly deep. The term first appeared around 1908 in British literature, but it really gained clinical traction in California in the early 1970s.
So it's been around.
Yeah, and by 1984, John Levy, who is the executive director of the C.G. Jung Institute in San Francisco, was using it to describe this profound lack of motivation and the strange, haunting melancholy that seemed to dog wealthy people.
A haunting melancholy.
Right. And then a PBS documentary in 1997 pushed it into the mainstream, defining it as a painful, socially transmitted condition of overload, debt, anxiety, and waste resulting from the dogged pursuit of more.
Okay, a haunting melancholy is a bit poetic for a clinical diagnosis. How is it actually defined in the literature we are looking at?
Informally, it's described as a quasi-illness causing an inability to understand the consequences of one's actions, specifically due to financial privilege.
Okay.
The term absolutely exploded in the media around 2013 during the tragic case of Ethan Couch. He was a wealthy Texas teenager who killed 4 pedestrians while driving intoxicated.
Right, I remember that.
A psychologist actually testified that Couch had affluenza, that his immense privilege meant his brain fundamentally couldn't link his actions to their consequences. And a similar narrative appeared in the 2015 Marco Muzzo case in Ontario.
Okay, wait, here's where I have to push back hard. Is it actually fair to call this an illness? Or is that just a very convenient, highly paid way to excuse abhorrent behavior by people who have absolutely everything?
I completely understand why you'd ask that.
Because calling it a disease feels like it removes all agency from the person causing the harm. It just feels like a legal loophole for the rich.
I understand the impulse to say that, and it's exactly why many psychologists consider it a pseudoscientific term when it's weaponized as a legal defense. But dismissing it entirely as an excuse ignores the MRI scans and the behavioral data.
What do you mean?
We are talking about severe structural developmental stunting, not just bad manners. When you strip an environment of natural friction, when a human being is entirely insulated from the real-world consequences of their choices from birth, it fundamentally alters their cognitive development.
So the brain literally develops differently without friction.
Yes. When researchers say quasi-illness, they're pointing to a literal neurological deficit in consequence mapping.
Wow. So the tension here is incredibly primal. It is the tension between our fundamental biological drive to achieve safety and success, to gather the resources that keep the cold away, versus our equally fundamental biological human need to connect, to be vulnerable, and to be truly known by others.
And modern society, particularly in corporate, medical, and academic cultures, turns this tension into a breaking point. Sociologist Soraya Luthar calls it high-octane achievement. We are asked to relentlessly accumulate resources and status, to project total ease, while exerting an entirely unsustainable amount of effort behind the scenes.
Which brings us to the two diverging lenses. From the relational lens, the one I'm looking at, this is a tragic emotional adaptation. We sacrifice our true selves to meet an impossible bar. All the wealth and success is just a byproduct of a terrified inner child still trying to be good enough.
But from the empirical lens, the resources themselves change us. Wealth doesn't just sit in a bank account. It acts on the nervous system.
It changes the brain.
Yes, it creates a measurable empathy gap and distorts the social ties required for healthy human development.
If you like sitting with questions that don't resolve easily, you're in the right place. Let's dig into the empirical mechanics first. You mentioned the empathy gap. What is actually breaking in the brain? Walk me through the neurobiology here.
Well, to understand the empathy gap, we have to look at how the brain processes other humans. Empathy is not a single emotion. It's actually split into two distinct neurologically separate processes: cognitive empathy and affective empathy.
Okay, break those down for me.
Cognitive empathy is perspective taking. It is the ability to mentalize, meaning to look at someone else and accurately guess what they are thinking or intending. It involves regions like the medial prefrontal cortex. It's essentially assigning a mind to someone else.
So cognitive empathy is just data processing. It's like, I understand that you are sad because you are crying.
Exactly. Affective empathy, on the other hand, is emotional sharing. It's feeling the distress of another person. It's when your own anterior insula lights up in an MRI when you see someone else in physical pain.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, affective empathy is the genuine wave of compassionate concern. I feel a pang in my chest because you are sad.
And what does the data show happens to these two systems when a person acquires wealth and status?
As resources accumulate, both of these systems demonstrate measurable degradation. The brain literally downregulates its neural mirroring.
It just turns it off.
Pretty much. And one of the most striking illustrations of this is a famous study conducted by Paul Piff at UC Berkeley. It's often referred to as the Monopoly study, and it perfectly isolates the mechanism of how advantage changes behavior.
Oh, the Monopoly study is wild. Walk us through exactly how they set this up, because the transparency of it is what makes the findings so disturbing.
Right. So they brought strangers into a lab to play a standard game of Monopoly. But the game was entirely rigged. In front of both players, the researchers flipped a coin.
Okay.
And based purely on that random coin flip, one player was designated the rich player. They were given twice as much starting money, they collected twice as much when they passed go, and they were allowed to roll 2 dice instead of 1, meaning they moved around the board much faster.
It's the definition of systemic privilege, but made completely transparent. There's no illusion of meritocracy here. Both players watch the coin flip. They both know the advantage is pure, blind luck.
Exactly. And Piff's team watched through hidden cameras to see how that transparent luck would affect behavior over just 15 minutes.
Just 15 minutes.
Just 15 minutes. As the rich players began to accumulate property and money, their entire neurobiology seemed to shift. They became demonstrably ruder. They started moving their game pieces louder, practically smacking them against the board to assert dominance.
Smacking the pieces on the board.
Yeah, and there was a bowl of pretzels on the table. The rich players started eating significantly more pretzels, chewing with their mouths open, taking up more physical space, spreading their arms out.
They became caricatures of greedy tycoons
Yeah.
over a 15-minute board game.
But here's the most crucial part regarding the empathy gap and how the brain protects itself. When the game was over, the researchers interviewed the rich players and asked them why they won.
And what did they say?
Overwhelmingly, the rich players talked about their strategy. They talked about the brilliant decisions they made to buy the right properties. They became entirely blind to the situational advantage they had. They completely minimized the random flip of the coin that made losing practically impossible for them.
Wait, let's look at the mechanics of that. Why does the brain do that? If you know it was a coin flip, why does your ego suddenly need to believe you are a real estate genius?
It comes down to cognitive load and ego protection. Specifically, a psychological mechanism known as the fundamental attribution error.
The fundamental attribution error.
Right. The human brain struggles to handle the existential dread of realizing its success is purely random or unearned. Because if your success is random, your safety is fragile.
That makes sense.
Right. So to prevent an existential crisis, the ego immediately rewrites history. It attributes positive outcomes to intrinsic internal traits like I am smart, I am strategic, and it attributes negative outcomes for others to their internal flaws. They were lazy, they made bad choices.
So the ego converts random luck into intrinsic skill to feel secure. And because they convinced themselves they earned it through skill, they felt absolutely no need to empathize with the player who was losing. They felt the other player deserved to lose.
Precisely. And PIF's broader research scales this up to the real world. Wealthier individuals in these studies consistently show higher levels of entitlement. They are statistically more likely to moralize greed.
Moralize greed.
Yeah, to actually agree on a survey with the statement that greed is a net positive and that the pursuit of self-interest is inherently moral. They are more likely to lie in negotiations or take bribes. The data suggests that insulation from consequence fundamentally decreases feelings of compassion and increases the ideology of self-interest.
So having the resources forces your brain to believe you inherently deserve the resources, which subsequently downregulates your ability to care about those who don't have them.
Exactly.
But is this purely a function of money? Or are there underlying personality traits that make someone more susceptible to this empathy gap?
It intersects heavily with a psychological trait called social dominance orientation, or SDO.
SDO, what does that mean?
Individuals who score high in SDO fundamentally endorse inequality. They believe that hierarchies between groups are not only natural but correct and necessary for a functioning society. High SDO scores strongly correlate with reduced empathic concern for outgroup members. And even more alarmingly, it correlates with Schadenfreude.
Schadenfreude, taking pleasure in the misery of others. But why? What is the evolutionary or psychological mechanism that makes a human being feel actual joy when someone from an outgroup suffers?
Well, evolutionarily, if you view resources as intensely scarce and life as a zero-sum game, an outgroup member's failure represents an in-group member's increased chance of survival.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so Schadenfreude isn't just malice. Mechanically, it's the brain rewarding you with a hit of dopamine because a perceived threat to your hierarchy has been diminished. When high SDO individuals see an outgroup member fail, their brain doesn't trigger effective empathy. It triggers a reward pathway.
That is terrifying.
Yeah.
How does this actually map across demographics? Because if we are looking at sociological survey data, I want to be incredibly careful here. We are strictly reporting what the data says about human behavior, not taking a political stance.
Absolutely. We are looking at this purely to examine how societal values and community structures shape neurobiology. If we look at the 2004 General Social Survey, which is a massive sociological data set in the U.S., researchers found distinct patterns in how empathy distributes.
Okay, what do they find?
For instance, when looking at political orientation, they found that conservatives generally reported lower levels of empathy than liberals. But, and this is a vital mechanism to understand only among individuals with low levels of religiosity.
So religion acts as a variable that changes the empathy outcome.
Yes. That same survey showed that high religious importance was significantly linked to higher effective empathy, particularly among Black, Indigenous, and people of color. What this tells us mechanically is that community ties, shared belief systems, and cultural requirements to care for the vulnerable serve as a neurological buffer. They act as a generator of empathy that actively pushes back against the isolating, empathy-destroying effects of extreme individualism.
Which brings us to the ultimate macro-level view of this.
Yeah.
If an individual's brain can catch affluenza through isolation and resource hoarding, can a whole country catch it?
Oliver James, a British clinical psychologist, argued exactly that in 2007. He coined the term selfish capitalism.
Risk capitalism.
Yes. He looked at the prevalence of emotional distress and compared it to income inequality across different nations. In English-speaking nations, places like the US and the UK, which lean heavily into market-liberal, highly individualistic policies, the rate of emotional distress was 21.6%.
21.6%. And how did that compare?
In mainland Europe and Japan, which tend to have stronger social safety nets, tighter community structures, and less stark material inequality, the rate was 11.5%, almost half.
Wow.
Almost half. James argued that extreme material inequality, driven by artificial needs created by the advertising industry, literally breathes a systemic cultural affluenza.
Okay, so that is the empirical structural lens.
Right.
The wealth changes the brain, the ego rewrites reality to protect itself, and the empathy machine degrades.
Right.
But I want to pivot to the relational lens.
Yeah.
Because when I look at the source notes from career coaches and therapists who work with people trapped in that gilded cage, the high earners, the executives, the surgeons, they don't walk into a therapist's office saying, I am suffering from selfish capitalism.
No, definitely not.
They walk in feeling like they're experiencing a profound crisis of identity.
They feel the symptom of the system rather than the system itself.
Yes. And to understand that symptom, we have to look at the history of where this concept comes from. We have to go back to mid-20th century London to a pediatrician and psychoanalyst named Donald Winnicott.
This is right in the post-WWII era, which was an incredibly anxious time in British history.
Exactly. Winnicott was observing babies and mothers in a society that was just trying to hold itself together. And through these observations, he developed a foundational framework in what is called object relations theory.
We should probably unpack that term.
Yeah.
Object relations theory essentially posits that our psyche isn't formed in a vacuum. It is built entirely out of the ghosts of our past relationships.
The ghosts of our past relationships. I love that.
We internalize our early caregivers.
Huh.
The objects and those internalized ghosts dictate how we interact with the world forever.
And through that lens, Winnicott developed the concept of the true self versus the false self. Winnicott said that the true self is the part of us that is spontaneous, creative, and feels a sense of realness. It's the self that knows it is loved simply for existing without having to do anything to earn it.
Right.
My favorite way to translate this is that the true self is who you are on a Sunday morning, alone in your kitchen, drinking coffee, wearing sweatpants, just staring out the window. There is no performance. You aren't being useful. You just are.
And how does the false self develop? Because it's not born out of malice, right? It's born out of necessity.
Right. The false self is a functional mask. It develops when the early environment and the caregivers cannot adequately meet the child's emotional needs. If a child's spontaneous gestures aren't mirrored, if they are told to quiet down because the parents are stressed, or if love is only given when they get an A on the math test, the child brilliantly adapts.
They figure out the game.
Yes, they create a compliant, highly attuned mask that anticipates what others expect. The false self is who you are when you walk into a networking event or a boardroom, full of people whose approval dictates your survival.
It's a defense mechanism masquerading as a personality.
Yes, and this is where the work of Peter Fonagy, a contemporary psychoanalyst, illuminates the exact mechanism of the emptiness. Fonagy talks about mentalization, which is our capacity to understand our own mental states, to know what we are feeling and why. He argues that we don't just magically possess self-knowledge. It's built in relationship. When a parent accurately reflects a child's feelings back to them like, I see you are angry right now, the child learns who they are.
Right. They get that mirroring.
But if early relationships only reward performance, the child develops an incredibly competent professional self. They learn, I don't know how I feel, but I know I am okay because I performed well and you applauded.
So their entire sense of identity is fundamentally tethered to an external scoreboard.
Right. And what happens when the scoreboard is turned off? What happens when you reach the milestone, you get the pristine house, and there is no more applause to earn?
The silence must be deafening.
It is. There is nothing underneath to land on. There is no Sunday morning coffee self. There is only the void. That is the emptiness at the top of the mountain. You didn't build a life for yourself. You built a life for the ghosts of your past relationships.
Wow. And this maps perfectly onto the research surrounding perfectionism and intimacy that we have in the notes. There is a fascinating study using a psychometric tool called the Family Almost Perfect Scale.
The family almost perfect scale.
Yeah, researchers used it to look at how perfectionism, specifically when imposed by family expectations, interacts with the fear of intimacy in young adults.
What were the findings? Because intuitively, you'd assume the people striving the hardest to be perfect, the ones with the thickest false selves, would be the most terrified of letting someone see their flaws.
Well, that was the hypothesis. The study clustered people into three groups: adaptive perfectionists, who have high standards but low anxiety about meeting them; maladaptive perfectionists, who have high standards accompanied by immense anxiety and self criticism; and non
They're up
perfectionists.
to three groups.
But the data point that stunned researchers was this: the non perfectionists actually scored the highest on the fear of intimacy scale,
Wait, what?
higher than both groups of perfectionists. They also found that fear of intimacy was highest among those who are not currently in romantic relationships.
Wait, really? Let's break down the mechanics of that.
Yeah.
Why would the people who aren't obsessing over being perfect be the most terrified of intimacy? If the false self is driven by perfectionism, why do the non-perfectionists struggle the most to connect?
It completely upends the intuitive assumption, right? Because if you aren't trying to be perfect, shouldn't you be more comfortable being vulnerable?
Let me theorize here based on the relational framework. If you are raised in a family system that demands perfection, and you realize early on that you can never ever meet that bar, what is your survival strategy?
You withdraw.
You withdraw. You don't become a maladaptive perfectionist driving yourself crazy. You just opt out of the game entirely. You avoid all evaluation. So these non-perfectionists in the study might actually be individuals who have entirely walled themselves off from the family system's pressure.
Oh, that makes sense.
They gave up on the performance, but they didn't magically find their true self. They just learned to hide completely. It shows that the fear of vulnerability destroys intimacy regardless of whether you try to be perfect or if you just give up entirely.
That makes profound mechanical sense. The withdrawal is just a different, quieter flavor of the false self-defense mechanism. It's the diver's suit, just painted a different color.
And this brings me to a specific, painful iteration of this struggle that I see constantly in the coaching notes. It's called the INFJ millionaire problem, or the issue of moral injury.
The INFJ millionaire.
Right. When highly sensitive, highly conscientious people, the ones who naturally see patterns and feel others' emotions, deeply start to accumulate wealth or success, they often panic. To them, money looks like greed. It looks like the people on the Monopoly study chewing with their mouths open.
So their psychological response is to reject the resources to preserve their moral identity.
Exactly. They try to prove their purity by staying financially modest.
Hmm.
But this creates a terrible, predictable sabotage map. Because they are highly competent, people constantly want their help. And because they are highly empathetic, they overgive.
They can't set the boundary.
Right. They do the extra research. They send the extra 20-minute voice note to a client on a Sunday. They give away their best thinking out of guilt, terrified of being perceived as greedy. And because they don't have a structural container for this empathy, it leads to massive under-earning and severe nervous system depletion.
They are literally bankrupting their own emotional and physical resources to avoid feeling like they belong to the outgroup of the wealthy.
Right. And eventually this leads to moral injury. They wake up one day and realize they are participating in their own exploitation. They're giving away their life force, staying small. And it hasn't actually made the world any better. It's just made them exhausted and resentful.
If we look at the patterns of how this shows up in real life, the collateral damage of this exhaustion and this empathy gap is incredibly steep, particularly when we look at the family unit. Sam Osherson and Soraya Luthor have done vital research on this.
The Luthor data.
Yeah, we have this cultural stereotype that the children of the wealthy are carefree, skipping through life on a safety net of trust funds, completely devoid of stress.
The classic untouchable rich kid trope.
But the data paints a profoundly different, much darker picture. Children from highly affluent families show significantly elevated rates of substance abuse, including hard drugs. They show higher patterns of cheating, delinquency, clinical depression, and anxiety compared to national averages.
Wow.
And looping back to the neurological changes we discussed earlier, they show lower baseline empathy scores.
Why? Mechanically, what is happening? If they have all the resources in the world, what is missing from their environment?
Two intersecting forces: the crushing pressure of high-octane achievement and deep physical and emotional isolation. The parents in these systems are often entirely consumed by the maintenance of their wealth or the demands of their executive roles.
So they aren't physically present.
Right. So the caretakers in the child's life, the nannies, the tutors, the elite coaches are transactional. They are paid to be there. Luther actually quotes Mother Teresa in her research, noting that the hunger for love is much more difficult to remove than the hunger for food.
That's a powerful quote.
You have these children living in gated mansions, surrounded by paid professionals, completely emotionally starved of unconditional reflection.
The false self is essentially mandated. The diver's suit is passed down to the next generation.
It is. And the empathy gap isn't just interpersonal, meaning between people. The research shows it is also intrapersonal. We develop a profound inability to empathize with ourselves.
An empathy gap toward our own self. How does that mechanism work?
In behavioral economics, it's a forecasting failure known as the hot-cold empathy gap. We consistently fail to predict our own future preferences or behaviors because we cannot empathize with our future selves.
Our future selves.
Right. When we are in a cold, rational, well-rested state, we vastly underestimate how much a hot emotional state like hunger, anger, or extreme exhaustion will hijack our decision-making.
Okay, so let me give an example. On Sunday night, I rationally plan to eat a healthy salad for lunch on Wednesday. I'm in a cold state. But on Wednesday at 1 p.m., after 3 brutal high-stakes meetings, my nervous system is in a hot, exhausted state, and I order a massive burger and fries.
Yes, exactly.
My cold self had zero empathy or understanding for the reality of my hot self.
Exactly. We make poor health decisions, poor financial decisions, and catastrophic relational decisions because we are trapped in the myopia of our present emotional state. We can't bridge the gap to the person we will be tomorrow or the person we were yesterday.
Okay, this is fascinating because this inability to bridge the gap, this hyper-focus on the present state or the exact task at hand shows up structurally in how we actually talk to each other.
It does, right down to the literal words we choose to use. There is an incredible study in the notes utilizing natural language processing, or NLP. Researchers used AI to analyze the conversational transcripts of married couples who were measuring something called latent semantic similarity, or LSS.
Latent semantic similarity. Okay, break that jargon down. What is a semantic space?
Put simply, LSS measures how closely two people share a semantic space during a conversation. Are they talking about the exact same topic, using the exact same contextual vocabulary?
Give me an example.
If I say, the dog needs to go to the vet, and you say, I'll call the vet at noon, we have very high LSS. We are locked onto the same semantic target.
Okay.
If I say, the dog needs to go to the vet, and you say, that reminds me of the golden retriever I had as a kid. The LSS is lower. You've introduced the new semantic direction.
Got it. So high LSS means staying hyper-focused, like a laser. Low LSS means wandering, like a floodlight.
Right. And the researchers wanted to know, does higher LSS mean a better, more positive conversation? The assumption from a standard shared mind perspective is that the more similar your language, the more connected and attuned you must be.
That makes intuitive sense.
But the data revealed a crucial paradox, entirely dependent on the context of the conversation.
What was the paradox?
In a conflict conversation, an argument, higher LSS is indeed better. Staying on the exact same topic directionally increases positive emotional experiences, or at the very least, mitigates negative escalation. If we are arguing about the household budget, we need to stay strictly on the budget.
Which makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Because if we are arguing about the budget and you suddenly bring up a grievance about something my mother said 3 years ago, the LSS drops, the floodlight turns on, and the argument explodes into a completely unmanageable fight.
Exactly.
High LSS in an argument is like a surgical laser. You need it to cut through a specific problem without burning the whole house down.
Exactly. But, and here is the mind-bending part of the study. In pleasant conversations, in happy moments of connection, lower LSS was associated with significantly greater positive emotional experiences.
Lower is better for intimacy. The floodlight is better than the laser.
Yes. When couples were just enjoying each other's company, the conversations that jumped around, that diverged into multiple chaotic directions, where topics wandered and evolved organically, generated the most positive emotion.
Oh, this is profound. Let's connect this back to the false self and the drive for high-octane achievement.
Okay, let's do it.
If you are a highly successful person, your false self has been trained by the corporate world or academia to be highly targeted.
Yeah.
You are rewarded for efficiency. You are rewarded for staying relentlessly on topic.
You're an LSS machine.
Yes. You're basically a master of high latent semantic similarity. You get in, you execute the objective, you stay focused.
You manage the conflict, you manage the spreadsheet, you eliminate the variables.
But the study shows that in pleasant intimacy, the human brain needs to do what psychologists call broaden and build. Wandering topics, bring up a random memory, trailing off into a joke that chaos is where true positive emotion lives. Intimacy requires a wandering beam.
Right.
So the highly successful false self, applying its incredible efficiency to a Sunday morning coffee with a spouse, accidentally ruins the intimacy. They're trained to execute a relaxing morning with high LSS, like a boredom agenda, and it feels suffocating and sterile to their partner.
They are bringing an industrial laser to a candlelit dinner,
Yeah.
and it fails completely to generate warmth.
More people carry both sides of this than you'd think. We have these incredible skills that built our safety, and those exact same skills are systematically dismantling our connection to the people we love.
So holding all this data, the neurology of the empathy gap, the history of the false self, the LSS conversational traps, what does this all mean? How do we sit with both of these truths without just despairing?
The very first step is removing the shame of the gilded cage.
Hmm.
If you are that person who is running a 200-person division making $500,000 a year and you feel like a total failure inside, we have to stop treating that as an individual moral pathology.
It's not a personal failing.
No, your false self is not a lie. It was a brilliant, incredibly effective, necessary adaptation to a system that demanded it for your survival. When the bar for love is impossible and the structural support is zero, naming the system removes the shame. It's not that your self-esteem is fundamentally broken, it's that the system is functioning exactly as it was designed to.
And part of that system is the structural reality that inherently pushes us toward an empathy gap. We cannot ignore the MRI data.
Exactly. We have to reclaim autonomy without self-betrayal.
Mhm.
And for the highly conscientious person, the INFJ type, who is terrified of becoming the tycoon in the Monopoly study,
Right.
this requires a massive reframe about money. Money is not a personality test. It is not a scoreboard of your virtue or your greed. It is simply a mechanical tool for autonomy. It is the ability to say no. It is the ability to choose what you work on and who you work with.
Which is a very different psychological goal than the accumulation of status or power over others.
Completely different. You see this pattern in the notes we gathered from financial therapists. They call it establishing your minimum effective wealth, or MUW.
Minimum effective wealth.
Yeah. What is the actual mathematical number that provides you with autonomy without requiring you to contort your ethics or burn out your nervous system to get it?
Yeah.
When you decouple money from status, you can start earning what they call clean money.
Clean money.
Right. Clean money doesn't bring anxiety. It brings a sense of relief and a sense of stewardship. You aren't avoiding wealth to prove you are pure, and you aren't hoarding it to prove you are safe from the world. You're simply using it to buy back your true self.
And the incredible news from the psychological data is that this reclamation is entirely possible because the empathy gap is not a permanent brain damage. It is highly neuroplastic. It is malleable.
Tell me more about that mechanism,
Yeah.
because hearing that wealth structurally destroys empathy can feel pretty hopeless. Like, are we just doomed once we cross a certain tax bracket?
We aren't. Paul Piff, the same researcher who ran the rigged monopoly study, ran a follow-up experiment. He wanted to see if the downregulated empathy could be reversed.
Okay.
So he took a group of wealthy participants, people who had already demonstrated lowered compassion and heightened self-interest in baseline testing, and he had them watch a video, a 46-second video about childhood poverty.
46 seconds. Less than a minute of intervention.
Less than a minute. It was simply a visual narrative reminder of the needs of others in the world around them. And immediately after watching that brief video, the researchers tested their willingness to offer up their own time to help a stranger in distress.
And what happened in the brain?
The rich participants became just as generous with their time as the poorer participants in the control group. That 46-second intervention completely restored their egalitarianism and their willingness to help.
That is amazing.
It proved that these differences are not innate. They are not categorical. The neural mirroring is highly malleable to slight changes in focus, little nudges of compassion. The empathy machine wasn't broken. It had just been turned off by an insulated environment. A single moment of perspective turned it back on.
That is incredibly hopeful. It means we don't have to quit our jobs, burn our corporate suits, and move to an ashram in Bali to find our souls. We just have to hold the tension. We exist in a system that rewards the false self and pushes us toward the empathy gap. That is a fact, Yet we can actively build interventions into our lives to keep our true selves alive.
We can watch the video. We can intentionally practice relational wandering, deliberately lowering our latent semantic similarity during a quiet evening at home, letting the conversation drift.
We can start asking, for the first time in perhaps decades, what do I actually want? Not what does my family want? Not what does the market reward? What do I want?
Because if we connect this to the bigger picture, the ultimate theme here isn't really about money or corporate success or even the neurobiology of empathy. The deepest root of this entire discussion is the primal human fear of being known.
Yes. The reason we chase affluenza, the reason we forge that heavy brass diver's suit of the false self, the reason we slip so easily into the empathy gap, it all stems from a terrified conviction that our true self, that Sunday morning coffee self, is inherently inadequate.
That if people saw who we really were, without the achievements, the money, and the armor, we would be rejected.
We substitute achievement for intimacy. Because a plaque on the wall, a bank balance, a promotion, those things can't reject us. They are entirely safe. But a human being can look at us, see us, and turn away.
And that is the terrifying risk of taking the suit off.
But the deeper connection we have to make is realizing that true wealth has nothing to do with accumulating resources to insulate ourselves from the world. True wealth is having the emotional bandwidth, the autonomy, and the courage to finally take off that heavy armor, step out of the gilded cage, and actually feel the sun on our skin.
Yeah.
If this conversation felt true for you, both sides of it, you're always welcome here. You can subscribe to Leone Patterns and keep sitting with us.
To summarize what we've explored today, we've looked at the profound tension between two realities. There is the psychological reality of how the accumulation of resources structurally isolates us, creating an empathy gap that blinds us to the experiences of others, leading to the condition known as affluenza.
Right.
And there is the relational reality of why we sought those resources in the first place, to build a highly competent false self to protect us from a world where love felt conditional.
Yeah.
What sits with me quietly is how incredibly adaptable our neurobiology is. We shape ourselves to survive our environments, even when those environments are paved with gold. But just as easily, a simple shift in focus, a 46-second video, a moment of shared wandering in a conversation can snap our shared humanity right back into place. We are never as far gone as we fear.
And before we go, consider this. If the false self was built to survive an environment that demanded absolute perfection and efficiency, what happens when artificial intelligence, which is inherently more perfect, more efficient, more compliant than we could ever be, takes over the high-octane achievement space? Will the total obsolescence of our false selves finally force us to remember who we actually are?
That's a good question.
Same pace, same questions. See you then.